Yeah, overlap
Leave
and
it.
step forward just a little bit.
Yeah, just almost.
Yep,
beside
further.
This?
All right, yeah.
I don't bite.
Yeah.
It might, but I don't know.
Go ahead.
I can't control my animal
Alright.
instincts.
All right.
Go inside him.
You guys ready?
Yep, this is good. Yep.
Welcome to Endgame. Today we're discussing the future of humanity and technology with special guest Kent Bai today. Woo!
Enthusiasm!
Yeah!
I like turtles.
It's hilarious.
Yes, thank you, Andrew.
Welcome to Endgame. Thank you, Mr. Snake. Yeah, Purple Pose here, Sykes here, and our very special guest Kent Bai. We're really excited to talk to him. I'm gonna let the music chill out, and then I think Purple Pose, we're gonna let you start, right?
All right, yeah. Musical interlude. So thank you for joining us. I think I vaguely knew that you were in VRchat, but I'm glad that you could make it here. So for those of you who who don't know, Kent Bai is a journalist who's been reporting on VR since early 2014, I believe.
Yep.
And
2014.
is the host of the Voices of VR podcast, where he interviews technical experts and people working in the field of VR and asking them about the potential of VR. You also are a writer for Road to VR, pretty prolific writer there, I believe. And
so the just to clarify, the Voices of VR, I've done about 800 interviews, and of those I've published about 626. And then so since episode 200, I've had my podcast syndicated on Road to VR. So I've only written a couple of articles, so it's mostly my podcast. And I've also done
I see.
I've recorded about 100 interviews about artificial intelligence, and then about 40 about mathematics, and I'm going to be starting one about philosophy, and I have another one about more spiritual topics. So so I kind of if I was at the full capacity, I'd be doing like 5 podcasts at once. Right now I'm at 2.
You need those arms. You need two sets of hands.
You'll need more arms in order to make that all happen.
And 2 brains.
Right.
That's
so,
awesome.
but yeah, I think they're all connected, all those different topics. So anyway.
Right, it sounds like it. And so the Road to AI podcast is the one you just barely started. That is
Voices of AI. Yeah, Voices of AI. Yeah. And that was just because.
But there's already 90 interviews or something, right? Like you already talked to a lot of people.
I've released 5 episodes there. So in the course of covering virtual reality, one of the things that happened was that I kept hearing about artificial intelligence. And so the first things that I think are the most compelling things for the intersection between AI and VR is going to be like interactive storytelling. And so you feeling like you're actually engaging with someone who feels like they're a human, and you have like a whole interactive narrative. It's kind of like the dream of the holodeck. And there's a lot of really, really, really hard problems to be solved before we get there, but that's kind of the trajectory. And so I just felt like in the future, when we have immersive and interactive stories within virtual reality, they're going to be driven by sort of an interactive drama machine, like a drama manager. So looking at AI as sort of distinct and separate than where VR is, they're probably 2 or 3 years ahead of what we're seeing within virtual reality. So but I expect over the next year or 2 and moving forward, they're just going to be fusing together a lot more.
I gotta say, I don't see a lot of artificial intelligence in VR, at least not that I know of, or not that I've recognized.
Not yet.
Well,
so it doesn't seem like it's implemented.
Well, Unity just implemented Watson SDK. So what that means is that you can now embed calls to Watson. And some people have been doing different experiments on that. They haven't been released yet, but something like the Human Interact was doing this Starship Commander game where you're in a spaceship and you start to talk to the computer, and your talking is kind of like the gameplay. So and rather than you just flying around and killing something, you have to do like diplomacy with these aliens, and you do that through the process of talking, and it's in VR. And it's something that they're just like at the very beginning and early stages of developing. The other thing is that at SIGGRAPH this year, NVIDIA had a robot, a Baxter robot, that was trained within virtual reality. So they were able to go in and teach this robot how to dominoes within VR, and they used the same code base to be able to like use that and put that into the Baxter robot. So they had the Baxter robot outside like playing dominoes with real humans, and then you could go into the virtual reality and then you interact with the virtual Baxter. But the fact that you can like do machine learning and all sorts of different reinforcement learning within virtual worlds, and it can be scaled out, means that in the future, we're like this, we have all these people here. As we are able to capture data, AI is going to be able to interact with humans, and we're going to be able to teach the AI the nature of how humans relate to each other. And then that eventually is going to be kind of fed back into like an embodied version of those AI within robots. So that's kind of like the trajectory that I see starting to happen, and we're already starting to see that.
It's interesting because I think you're making an interesting point that, because I've looked at this data too, the motion capture data. I had an experiment where we captured like 600 people's motion capture. And it's interesting because, you know, there's a lot of training data that's going to be produced. I mean, Facebook basically with Oculus is going to have thousands or millions of people's movement data that they're going to be able to use to train AI and things like that to detect different emotional states and things. So I think it's interesting to think about all of a sudden you can quantify things that you're not able to and feed that into the machine learning algorithms to drive AI and potentially kind of further it from where it is today and those kinds of things.
That's funny. That goes back to, like, that's interesting. That goes back to the privacy thing that we touched on a little bit earlier, where they're recording all of our movements and all of our behaviors, and all that data just belongs to them.
I think this is robots. Well, so here's the dilemma of as we move forward is that the companies are going to be increasingly data hungry. They're going to want more and more data because you can do more and more amazing things with that data. The trade-off is that you are basically giving them a roadmap to your unconscious psyche. The more and more information they have, they're going to know you better than you know yourself. In some ways, they may know that already. Like, they're getting all of our unconscious behaviors, what we're paying attention to, what we're looking at. As we move on to the technological roadmap, we have galvanic skin response, we have like our heart rate variability, we have our eye tracking data, we have our emotional states, our facial expressions. All of these things are like biometric data that is basically a huge gold mine in the eyes of companies like Google and Facebook, because what that represents is basically like the Rosetta Stone of our psyche. They're going to be able to very specifically target information to us. Now, the downside to that, of course, is that the line between advertising and thought control starts to just completely dissolve once you get to that level of information. And so you basically are creating the infrastructure for complete totalitarian control over us. And I think that's the other trends that I see right now, is that there's this since the internet in 1993, or the World Wide Web, 5 out of the 10 top companies in the United States, the highest capitalized companies, are technology companies. So like Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, also known as Alphabet, as well as Microsoft. So these companies basically hold the keys to the future. And those that are doing this technological innovation are going to continue to have that huge level of economic and political control over and cultural control. And the big key is, are they going to continue to centralize their power, or are there going to be decentralized crypto networks that are going to be able to kind of break up their sort of hold on both the advertising industry, but there's just all sorts of ripe for abuse and problems with that. So that's what I see, is that there's things like self-sovereign identity that is going to be coming in to kind of replace these centralized models. And so that's what I see as a hope, that we're going to not just have these centralized systems, but decentralized ones as well.
I gotta ask, so with all the experience that you have gathering this information and the hundreds of interviews you've had, you're so informed on these things. Does this stuff scare you? Like, how nervous are you about
Yes.
our destiny?
Well, everything I just said is what I'm like terrified about. And I think that like anybody who's into VR, and if you look at it long enough, you see that it's like the best of times and the worst of times. It's like, and I think that's the story of all technology, is that it has these extreme polarity states of either it's going to create the foundations of a utopian future, or it's going to be the foundations of a dystopian future. And so I think that you have like cautionary sci-fi like Black Mirror that is fully expressed and exploring what those horrible potentials are. And then you have something like, I'd argue like virtual reality is a perfect medium by which you can world build these like amazing futures that you want to actually see in reality. So it's a kind of a prototyping for next, generation and new paradigm culture and behaviors. We can start to actually build the structures and the systems and build a culture around stuff before it actually exists in reality. So I see that, yes, it's so encouraging, but also extremely like concerning and terrifying. The good news that I see is that everybody's sort of like addicted to their like cell phones and looking at their screens. I see that there's a huge backlash to that right now. People sort of just unplugging and checking out from Facebook and social media. And then it's actually like the more that you do virtual reality, the more that you really do it, you actually get more bodied, more present, more embodied, and it's less dissociative, less escapist. So I think it's sort of like VR is an antidote to this sort of screen-based culture that is driving a lot of addiction.
Yeah, I think we are returning. We've gone from like socialization, in-person socialization before technology really took off, to depersonalized socialization that was removed. We talked about that in a previous episode, and now we're kind of returning to that more personalized, social interaction. But it seems like we're at this intermediary time where it's temporary. We're just starting to get Oculus Dash and heads-up displays. Like, we will have the equivalent of the mobile phone in VR, where anyone here could be checking. I mean, I don't know how many people are even in Oculus Dash, but like you could be in Dash, but then soon you'll be able to, look at your phone and kind of have the same things that have kind of creeped into reality to distract people in the virtual world, combined with the control that these companies have over us. And it's, I guess, I don't know. I mean, like, where do you see, do you think that overall we're heading towards, I mean, you mentioned also the positive versus the negative. Like, where do you think we're heading? Like, kind of the end. Like, do you think everything is going to be positive or negative, or I don't know?
Well, what I would say, whether it's positive or negative is really up to the culture and how we respond. If we are unconscious about it, it will be terrible, and we will be, basically in the worst surveillance state you could possibly imagine. But if we're conscious, we could actually have like, the most incredible, private expression of our true selves and identities. So the way that I see the overall trends is that we're moving away from like the information age and moving into the experiential age. And specifically, we're going to be much more immersive, interactive. There's going to be much more personalization. It's going to be much more about like having experiences that unfold over time rather than having sort of access to, data. So, or owning things. So I think that we've been into a very consumer culture that is driven by owning lots of trinkets. But once you're able to have like a symbolic representation of those things, you don't need to own it. You just need to have access to the experience of that. Great example is both Netflix and Spotify. You don't own all of the movies or the DVDs or the music. You just want to have access to that library at any moment and any time. And so it's like on-demand access to those experiences of that content. It's not about you owning it, because you just have to be in the moment and experiencing it. So moving away from moving to subscription models and a world where it's like much more like virtual reality or a live stream, you kind of have to, we're here and all together, and you're having this experience of being here. It's going to be a lot different than if you're watching it later. And so I think that's the trend, is like we're moving into a much more experiential as well as spatial. So right now we're in a virtual reality, and I think we're prototyping a lot of the 3D user interfaces that are going to be eventually into augmented reality. So with augmented reality, we're going to be able to kind of layer kind of a layer of meaning and context on top of our world. And so the big question is, does that layer of context and meaning, does that actually help us get more present to our reality? Does it allow us to get into deeper flow states? Or is it dissociative and disconnecting and serving somebody else's sort of agenda? So I think that's the big dynamic that I think is in the future, that it's like by 2025, we're going to have, I'd say, like head-mounted displays that are augmented reality, and that the virtual reality is going to kind of cross the chasm and be kind of just much more ubiquitous than it is today. And I don't know, it could be up to 2045, but I think that we're on the trajectory of much more interaction and immersion. So whether it's 2025 or 2045, we're on this road towards immersive and interactive entertainment.
Do you think there's a possibility that, like, I think we all kind of feel that society as it is now is a little bit busted, like it's a little bit dysfunctional, and part of that is because of the way it developed. Like we came from you know, intelligent apes to humans, to having agriculture, to having cities, to having civilization, but like that was not a process of design. It was just a process of like, you know, kind of forced cooperation. But I was listening to the podcast about decentralization of identity and having a self-sovereign identity, and the way they were talking about it reminded me of like you could carry around your ID to all these different VR experiences in these different VR places and have the same ID. It kind of just reminded me of a governmental system, how you have a social security number and you have like a driver's license and everything that facilitates that in the real world. Like, is the virtual world like a chance to rebuild civilization, like in a way that we could design? Yeah, I mean, you mentioned being conscious about what we're doing.
Absolutely. No, I do think that. Go ahead.
Well, like I guess how possible is that? Because I hear, like when I listen to your podcast, I hear lots of people who are really interested in doing this consciously and doing it intelligently, and so that's what I hear. But there's also all these forces in the world, these commercial forces in the world.
Yes.
They're so huge and so overwhelming, and profit is their like that's what they care about, with no end goal behind that profit. Like, so how? I don't know. How likely do you think?
So when I did an interview with Neil Trevitt, he's the president of the Kronos Group, and one of the things he said is that every successful open standard has a proprietary competitor. And so I think that's an important lesson, because I think that's kind of applies to every system. So in other words, you have the closed walled gardens that are able to create like a very uniformed like user experience. So the Apples of the world have the iPhone, you go in there, it's a beautiful experience, but you pay for it. You get charged, and it also consolidates the power in those companies. The decentralized model, something like Android, is much more open and free, but it takes a lot longer for it to get on parity to the iPhone experience. You have a very fragmented experience with Android, and it can be very frustrating sometimes. But there's a lot more control. So there's these different trade-offs you have with decentralization and centralization. But right now, our economic models are very much preferencing decentralization. So like I said, there's like these 5 companies that are basically controlling so much of the future of our reality. But there are a lot of decentralization forces that are coming with crypto networks and systems that have a much more equal amount of exchange. So in the existing capitalistic model that we have, it's basically winner takes all. And they're able to essentially, like, if they're able to innovate, there's kind of like an exponential growth of there's like the power law curve dynamic, such that once you start winning, you just keep winning much, much more. And so that then it becomes like this distribution where 20% of the people are kind of controlling 80% of the resources. And that sort of applies on all different dimensions of reality. And so the counterforce to that is the decentralization forces that are driven by a lot of just community spirit and collaboration, and just more of a philosophical belief that there's going to be a new world that's possible. So something like High Fidelity is an example where they're trying to actually implement a lot of that, but actually the centralization forces of VRchat actually makes it such a better experience that there's just way more people are hanging out here. So it's a little bit of like VRchat is an example of, like, even if you look at the social VR spaces, they're kind of on top right now because they have all of this creativity and participation, and that's just a dynamic of like how just people work and how systems work.
Yeah.
So I do think that it's going to be possible to prototype new systems. And the advantage of crypto networks is that rather than the winner take all sort of model of more of the existing economic systems of capitalism, there's a little bit more of a balance between the cooperation and competition, the yin and the yang. So you basically are able to help and share your GPU resources, let's say in the future, to either serve files or verify different transactions that are happening on this, ledger on the blockchain, that you're actually helping participate in the process of doing that. You get money back in return for those cryptocurrencies. So I have a podcast and I do a Patreon. So I'm like giving out all of my content for free. And I'm like hoping that people listen to it and enjoy it enough so that they can like take some of their extra money or income and be able to give it back to me. So I'd like it, but it's also very difficult. It's like I have to be at a certain level, and there's like only like 3 to 5% of the people that give. So you have to sort of get at a certain level before you can really do that in a sustainable way. But I think that's where things are going, is the model where basically everybody is just doing exactly what they want to do, but there's an economic system of exchange and a gift economy, which with more decentralized sort of networks and infrastructure, so that you can actually make a viable living doing that. And I think that that's what makes it so exciting about technology, is that it's going to enable us to do that. But there's no guarantee that like the centralized systems aren't going to just continually like completely dominate and win in the long run.
Yeah, I hope not, but there kind of doesn't seem to be an effective way to counter their amount of power without centralizing something yourself and becoming a competitor. And like it has to happen like emergently and organically if it's going to happen. It seems like.
Well, either it's sort of happening.
Well, either it's going to be like, I don't think that like. One model is to have the government come in and try to regulate things, but Chris Dixon wrote an article about, kind of like decentralized networks. And once you have like an open platform where you can put any code that you want, it becomes very difficult to kind of come in from the outside and control it. And so when you look at like someone like Facebook or Google, the thing that really actually makes them concerned or do things when there's like a viable alternative of people that are doing things and sort of the network effects of that competitor that's coming up. So it's like using the market forces. And so when there's like you making a decision, you're making a decision as to like where you're going to spend your time and energy, and sort of being a little bit more conscious of that connection, and where you can support alternatives to be able to kind of counter this weight of the centralization.
I guess, I'm curious for the audience, like, what do you guys think? Like, I guess thumbs up or thumbs down kind of emoji. Like, do you think that I guess these kinds of advances in like blockchain technology and things like that, yes or no to they're going to be able to kind of combat Facebook and Google and that thing, or thumbs down if you think that Facebook and Google and those companies are just going to kind of maintain control as we develop new technologies and things like that.
So thumbs up if we think decentralization wins, thumbs down if the monopolies crush us.
Not right away.
Yeah.
We're pretty
Not right away, okay.
We see a few.
Okay.
We have a few.
It's pretty optimistic.
It's good. It's good. It's
Yeah.
good. I think it's realistic. I think it's it's a
Owlboy, I see you have your hand up.
How decentralization?
Yeah, come to the center. Come.
Because it also.
Yeah, come to the
I'm
center.
sorry. Could you give more of a concrete example, like maybe a more focused example of how decentralization could help with this stuff? Because it still sounds really vague, and the blockchain.
I have a question, or like is the way the internet is set up right now with the domain server, like the domain name system and everything like that, is that a decentralized system?
Well, it is, but there's a centralized point. But to answer Owlboy's questions more directly, what I would say is that think of the example of Visa. When you go to a grocery store and you're giving them a credit card, Visa is basically saying, yes, Owlboy has the money in your bank to be able to actually pay for this. And that you don't get charged, but the companies that do that get charged a transaction fee to be able to mediate that trust. They find it more valuable to kind of offload that to someone like Visa, and they work at a certain scale that they don't mind that. But let's say like everybody here, if you wanted to give me like 2 cents, Well, the transaction fee would be like 50 cents. And so I would get, it'd be sort of worthless. And so when it comes to microtransactions, that's where, because we don't have a system by which you can distribute that trust, then it becomes very difficult for you to give me a few cents without the majority of that money that you're trying to give me to go to the thing that the entity like Visa that's trying to mediate that trust. So macro transactions and micropayments are something that just simply haven't existed in a viable format because of the economics of the whole situation. And so something like the blockchain technologies could allow you to do that. So that's a very concrete example of the types of economies that can kind of emerge and stuff that's already happening today. Now, at the same time, there's other issues with the cryptocurrency networks, and there are technically transaction fees that happen, but there's also lots of different cryptocurrencies that are trying to take different approaches to that and different philosophies for how you actually kind of do that mechanism of paying for that labor to be able to do that distributed authorization of that trust. So hopefully that makes sense.
Are there any models we can refer to for a successful decentralized system?
Well, the internet, I think, is just the fabric of the protocols and the open standards that have been developed by the W3C, and also computers. Computers are an open system. Like both Oculus and HTC Vive, the virtual reality, as we know, is this kind of consumer revolution would have never happened had the platform of a computer been open so that you can put in a port and be able to do whatever you want with it. So both the internet and virtual reality itself are just two examples of that, but you can go on and on of the types of technologies that have been made possible by the open standards.
So how are those systems enabled? What causes those to happen where you don't get those centralized walled gardens? What's different with those than is different, say, like in the social media sphere right now?
Well, so it comes down to whether or not you can have a private entity give a better user experience. And at some point, even right now within the virtual reality community with the Kronos group, you have all of the major virtual reality creators saying, look, we don't want to have a fraction, like just this fragmented system. We want to have open standards so that if someone like Leap Motion or some sort of peripheral can come in, they don't have to integrate with like 50 different SDKs in order to like make a go of being a business. They just have to shoot for one target for what you do for the input and the output, and then you're going to have much more sort of peripherals being able to be seamlessly integrated with all of the different VR headsets and technology. So I think it's already started to happen within the VR community. It hadn't been when I first started doing the podcast in May of 2014. In fact, I did an interview with Neil Trevitt in the March of 2015 at GDC, and he said, we're not ready yet. But then within the next year, there's been processes of that started already. And so for the past year so I expect probably around GDC this year, we may have an update as to like what the Kronos group and what these open standards have been working on. And what that means is that, so here's the challenge. If you put the open standards up too early, you basically say, like, let's say like if you wanted to have all finger tracking in your VR system and then no one else did it, that would mean that if the open standard was implemented, you would never have the potential to be able to do full finger tracking because the standard was set. So there's risks with setting that standard too early. But because they've waited on that, then we kind of like, for example, when WebVR was first being started, we didn't have like positional tracking. We didn't have all these different things. And so by the time they actually sat down to like start to standardize it for the open web, there had been at least 2 or 3 different major innovations that had happened in the space that made them completely rethink how they were going to design it, both with positional tracking as well as 6-degree of freedom tracking and with like augmented reality being layered on top of that as well. So I think that like there's a lot of examples that are already happening with immersive technology where there's so much like benefit to that happening that, but at the same time, you have someone like Apple who has been completely closed and not said anything. They may come out and just say, this is our integrated solution, and it may not play nice with the rest of the immersive sort of community. So there's a bit of like everybody kind of waiting to see. They've been talking a lot about augmented reality, but not much about virtual reality. So we're kind of like, they tend to kind of swoop in later and do a kind of a unified user experience. And so there's kind of an advantage of waiting back and holding to see and to really address some of the biggest problems that they need to. But right now you have virtual reality, you have phone-based AR, And then over the next, 8 years, we're going to be seeing a lot more like head-mounted augmented reality headsets that are going to eventually everything's going to be just one headset and it's going to be able to do both. But right now they're kind of fragmented in that way.
And I guess like,
Excited
so
for that.
what is the potential? Like, what do you think actually like the ultimate potential, as you like to ask,
Yeah, what do you think?
everyone?
When is
like,
the
what
singularity going to happen, and what will it look like?
Yeah, like what's
So-
what's gonna happen?
So I've asked over 800 people now what they think the ultimate potential of VR is, and over 100 people ultimate potential of AI. I'm starting to see different patterns and connections. And at the end of the day, it's all about the human experience. And so what are the different ways that these technologies is going to get us more connected to different dimensions of our human experience, specifically how we experience entertainment, how we connect to our home and family, how we are able to explore and to connect to different religious practices or philosophical ideas or education or communication or expression identity, being able to interface with our resources in a new way, how we deal with death and grieving and loss, how to have relationships and dates within virtual reality and business partnerships, as well as like our friends and our community and our social network, as well as like how to deal with like just being immobilized or kind of like dealing with our unconscious psyche. So those are the kind of like the different domains of the human experience. And the question is like, how are the technologies going to change our relationship to each of those different domains? And so I think it's sort of the most simplest, it's going to make us more connected to ourselves, to each other, and to the cosmos. And so part of the reason why I've started the Voices of Math podcast is because if you ask what is the nature of reality, if you keep on going lower and deeper down into that question, you get down to like, well, maybe base reality is a layer of mathematics and some sort of symbolic reality. And then maybe on top of that is some sort of archetypal reality of Platonic ideal forms. Anything that's non-local and beyond space-time is kind of like up in the air as to what it actually is. We can't empirically observe it, but we can sort of philosophize about it. And then maybe there's a layer of consciousness and a general awareness and being. And so it's a big question as to whether that layer of consciousness is a fundamental part of the universe. So it's like at the ground fabric layer before things, emerge into physical reality, or maybe it's an emergent property where you have physics and chemistry and biology and psychology and our neurology. And at the very top, consciousness comes and it's just an artifact of all of our physical reality. Or maybe consciousness is something that permeates all of reality. So every photon, every electron could be conscious. It's the sort of the panpsychic idea or the ancients' idea of the anima mundi, the world soul. And that's just the idea that, every single entity on the planet has some sort of consciousness and you can interface it with it in some way. Or maybe it's just a fundamental field that is something that is like gravity, and we haven't been able to detect it or discern it yet because we haven't been able to mathematically model human beings yet. And they're kind of inconsistent and paradoxical. So even if you try to use a logical system to model human beings, you have to use something like paraconsistent logic. So something that is able to deal with contradictions and paradox and inconsistencies. So what I see is that like virtual reality as a whole is an ability to be able to unify things on a human experience. You're starting to see all sorts of different interdisciplinary collaborations between people from different backgrounds, and they're able to collaborate and to unify from wherever they're coming from on the basis of human experience. And so as we move forward, we're moving away from like the information age and we're moving into the experiential age. So, but there's still so many different open questions. Primarily, what is the nature of consciousness? What is the nature of reality? Is it emergent or is it fundamental and universal? And are there experiences that you can create within virtual reality to be able to empirically test at an experiential level and maybe get some sort of insight into some of these questions?
Yeah.
Or maybe they're metaphysical questions that you're never going to be able to figure out.
People are doing research on that already. I read a scientific article about someone who did a study about out-of-body experiences in VR. And so it was like a kind of they simulated an out-of-body experience and were basically measuring like how people's perception related to their identification with their body, which I think it ties into whether consciousness is localized, right? Whether it's tied into a specific location or whether it is part of a bigger field.
Well, an out-of-body experience is a perfect example that sort of outlines how, if you're a material reductionist, you would say that consciousness is emergent, and an out-of-body experience is just simply impossible. It doesn't happen. It's just like a sort of an illusion, something that's sort of you're tricked or you're fooled. Maybe it's like a dream. But if you do believe, yeah, well, so the problem is that the way that our philosophy of science is that you make a prediction, you test it. Now, if you're talking about something that is untestable, like this sort of imaginal field of consciousness, but you can't have an empirical test to be able to test it or not, then it becomes a metaphysical idea, and it becomes a matter of philosophy, not of science.
Yeah,
so you can't have case studies in that case, right? Like if you get enough case studies of a specific thing, you can infer certain pieces of data, even if you can't test something.
But that's not, the way that science works is that you create a model of reality. And then if you have something that is outside of that model, like an anomaly, then you either have to discard that information or you have to expand your paradigm so that you can encompass this new information. I would argue that consciousness could be an anomaly that requires us to do a complete sort of philosophical shift for what we sort of model reality. But we haven't, and there's institutions out there like the Institute of Noetic Sciences that has been doing all sorts of research, but it's been in the realm of things like out-of-body experience or sort of precognition, parapsychology. There are things that people within the mainstream paradigm say are completely impossible, so we can't, look at them as something being legitimate. So what has to happen is that you have an anomaly, you make a prediction, you do a test, and then it's be able to be replicated by other people that are out in the scientific community, and that's how science happens. However, there may be a limit by which some of these things are untestable. And if they're untestable, then it's a little bit more of like, if people come into virtual reality and have an experience of it, then maybe that is something that changes the culture. So as an example, you have something like meditation or yoga. These are systems that were created by people who believed that there was a general layer of awareness and being. And they said, in order to really get access to that general layer of being and awareness, you have to quiet your mind and sit there for like 20 hours and do that every day for like, decades in order to get real access to that. Now, if you don't believe that general layer of awareness of being actually exists, you're not going to do that practice and you're not going to like be motivated to actually get connected to that. The same thing with yoga. In order for you to actually get present and relax your body, you do all these poses, and then maybe you're able to get access to these different awareness of being. So there's these different embodied spiritual practices that we have been colloquially doing, but because it doesn't have any sort of direct way that we can measure what the nature of consciousness is, it hasn't proved anything. It just gives people the experience of it. Just like people, if you ever try to describe what VR is to someone who's never tried it, you're at a loss to try to actually describe it. So you have to have the direct experience. And that's part of what the experiential age is saying, is that there's all these things that you cannot describe to people intellectually until they have the experience. Meditation, yoga, and virtual reality are all in that same realm. And that's part of the reason why I tend to be a little bit more of open to the ideas like panpsychism, because I've had a whole wide range of different sort of esoteric experiences that doesn't fit within the constructs of material reductionism, which is to say you can't predict and falsify human experience. You can't say like, this is going to be my human experience, I'm going to test it, because human beings are like, there's a difference between like the arts and humanities and science, and storytelling and humans tend to be on the storytelling and arts and humanities side because it's something that sort of transcends what science is able to really describe. So either science is limited, or there's like, science has to expand in order for us to, come up with the underlying patterns and reality of the nature of human beings.
But going back to a previous point, do you think that that's where AI might be able to step in as a role and be like an interface there?
So AI is that exact process of trying to map the different dimensions of human behavior and intelligence. So like whenever we're talking right now, I'm using words, and you're able to, at an unconscious level, interpret what those words mean, as well as connect them to your whole embodied experience of every word that I'm talking about from your life experiences. And so AI is really dumb right now. It doesn't have a whole rich life experiences to be able to compare that to. And so it's just trying to take the semantic meaning and look up dictionary words, but it's like, the meaning that I'm conveying to you through these words is a lot more rich and sophisticated sophisticated of talking about this whole layer of metaphysical, philosophical layers of reality that an AI would not be able to really discern. So the whole task of artificial intelligence is to like basically codify this whole layer of meaning that's like, you know, we say the words, but it's actually a deeper meaning and has to sort of interpolate what those meanings are. And we call systems that can do that intelligent because they're able to make inductive leaps of logic that are sort of dealing with incomplete and inconsistent information. If I'm sort of misspeaking or saying something wrong, you may be able to infer what I actually mean with what I actually said. So artificial intelligence is on this path and trajectory of using like neural network technologies that are trying to mimic our neurology of our brain. So I kind of consider like these machine learning techniques as a form of like embodied wisdom, intuition, that it's like our vision. I'm able to see that that's a column right there because I have a life experience and I see the structures of a column. But this is something like AI has to sort of be trained to be able to do all these different feature detections. And so just as you have all these layers of unconscious processing, there's going to be layers of unconscious processing with AI. But AI is not just that layer of unconscious processing. You actually have to be able to plan and make decisions, and the more constraints and planning aspects of AI are the things that are going to be able to actually, once you have that information, what do you do? What's the decision that you're going to make? What's your plan? Where are you going to go? What's your strategy? How do you collaborate with other people? So just like, you know, in virtual reality, I see that there's different dimensions of presence. There's like embodied presence, social and mental presence, active presence, and emotional presence. There's corresponding levels of intelligence within artificial intelligence, which include like manipulative intelligence. So how are you interacting with the world to be able to learn about it? That's like the equivalent of like the active presence. So the embodied presence is in the AI is like perceptual awareness, as well as like robots, and how are artificial intelligence going to be embodied within embodiments, and that's like robotics. And then you have like the social presence as well as the mental presence, and that's basically like the cognitive intelligence and all the different collaborative AI, so how do AI agents collaborate with each other. And then emotional presence. In both cases, there's emotional intelligence and emotional presence. The emotional intelligence is not only, it's not that the AI has to be like have feelings, it's more about how do AI detect the feelings of humans so that they can actually be integrated and normalized.
Yeah, but we're also not sure what emotional intelligence is even in humans as well. Some of these constructs as well that we're trying to define in AI, we don't even fully understand in humans.
Well, every single different dimension of these different levels of intelligence is exactly right, that we don't know, which as we try to create AI, we actually have these Turing tests of the next generation, which are basically benchmarks that say, well, if an entity can do these different things, then we're going to call that intelligent. And so we're going to be looking to humans as a model, but there's all sorts of really, like each of these different dimensions, it's not just the Turing test to kind of, you know, trick me into believing that whoever I'm talking to on the other side of the computer is an AI. It's going to be like, what are all the different tests that we're going to be able to do, the benchmarks? And it's essentially the hardest problems within AI, being able to understand context and be able to collaborate with other people, and to be able to do natural language processing in a way that can do pronoun disambiguation. I mean, the list of all those tests go on and on and on, and that's a lot of what I'll be sort of diving into with the Voices of AI, is talking to those AI researchers to kind of break down, you know, what are the benchmarks and the tests that are driving their work forward. But right now, AI is kind of like, it's not got that intelligence built into it, and so it's kind of dumb. It can be very, very constrained small tasks, like Atari games or other things, or image recognition. But, you know, throwing an AI out into the world and expecting it to like act like a human, we're pretty far away from doing that. But if we're going to do it, it's going to likely happen in virtual reality first, and we're going to see like AI agents that are going to be in VR, and your interactions with them are going to be like training them, and hopefully not for like nefarious purposes for like spamming, but that's certainly going to be happening. But there's going to be all sorts of other pro-social, you know, potentials as well. But I would say, and after looking at the ultimate potential of VR and the ultimate potential of AI, there's a huge overlap in terms of like where it comes down to essentially them being mirrors to the nature of humanity. And the more we look at virtual reality, the more we learn about the nature of human experience. And the more that we look at AI, the more we learn about the nature of intelligence, which is kind of like there's a lot of open questions around that.
I'm really
Yeah,
excited
yeah.
to have an AI friend in VR that loves me no matter what and teaches me everything and has the objective truth and just everything about, you know,
Alexa.
only me in mind. We got to get to the audience because we've been almost going for
Sure.
an hour already.
Okay.
So Catapult, please.
My question is, well, question, statement, whatever. I'm just wondering if and when the corporations will ever get over their arrogance, meaning like either whether it be your PlayStation, your Xbox, or whatever, as soon as you turn it on, you can't use it if there's a firmware coming up. If you don't accept the firmware, that's it. It's a paperweight. So you know, they shove their ideas down your throat, and they'll come up with a new user interface. They'll make changes that they figure you'll like, but you don't like, and there's no way of going back to the old way. Take, for example, Steam a few months ago. They got rid of the chaperone system for Oculus. On Oculus, we used to be able to use the chaperone system in Steam. Now, they don't. You have to use the crappy Oculus Guardian system, which sucks as compared to the Guardian system. The Guardian system's a lot more configurable and whatnot. But we didn't get a choice. They could have put an option, bring it back or get rid of it and go to Guardian. But no choices, no nothing. They just, their arrogance is just, that's it. You don't have a 5, you lose Guardian.
So when will we rebel against these corporations because they put us in a box that we can't stand anymore?
We don't have a say in anything.
I think you have to, like, for me, when I hear a question like that, there's many different layers of, like, what are the rules by which these companies are operating? And the underlying operating system of our entire country are, like, there's a layer of, like just legal rules that are from the government, but there's also, like, economic rules. And so if you ask why enough times for any question like this, if you ask why enough times, it'll always come back to money. And if you can answer that question by, or you can create an alternative system by which, you know, you have a different system by which the collaboration and cooperation actually gets them more money, then people will do that. And so I think that there's different, and a lot of it is that they're able to be centralized and provide a unified user experience. And that centralized unified experience often can be better than the fractured, fragmented experience that's the alternative. And so they're actually cohesive in their experiential design, but there's trade-offs, and that trade-off is that you lose freedom. And when you lose freedom, then, like, at some point, what point do you lose your freedom so much that you actually rebel to do an alternative system? And so there's a reason why, like, you know, Linux is out there, but it's really like the people who are like basically like Richard Stallmans of the world, who are like, I'm never going to use anything that doesn't use, like, free software. And he has like an ideological bar that is so high that he can't use basically anything on the internet. So, like, his values and his beliefs, like, he's living it, but he's also, like, in a world that's sort of like not a great sort of user experience. So every person has to make that choice as to what compromises are you willing to do from your own values versus the experience that you can get. And if you don't like it, then what are the entities that you can support that can create a better experience and a better alternative that's going to create a market pressure that's going to, like, force them to kind of change their ways. So I think that, like, in the future, that's again, that gets back to this whole tension between the centralization and the decentralization, and what are the things that we can do in the future that's going to sort of balance it out, so it doesn't just come down to money and greed, but it comes down to, and that's the yang competitive principle, and the more yin cooperative principle is, like, how can you foster cooperation and collaboration and stuff that's going to be serving of the community's interests, not their own private interests. And I think that balance is kind of the essence of, like, that's, in some ways you could say that's like the story of all of humanity right now, is trying to balance that at every different dimension of every industry is trying to figure that out. And I think technology has the advantage is that you can actually implement systems that can actually have that balanced systems, which I think that's why the decentralized, you know, cryptocurrency and blockchain systems are so, you know, amazing that it could actually implement that. But
the part that pisses me off is they get to the point where they know they got you, pardon the expression, they know they got you by the balls, and then they can do whatever the hell they want with you. I can't use VR unless I use Steam, right? I can't use VRchat without Steam because there is not an Oculus-only version. So I have to go to Steam. And I've bought some games on Steam. and I bought some software on Steam. But now they, for whatever reason that they decided, let's change this. The hell with how people like it. We're just going to shove this down their throat.
But we're in a very early phase with something like the Kronos Group and the open standards that they're coming out. We'll hopefully address some of these issues so that there's kind of like a unified sort of standard that even if it's like the Windows mixed reality headsets or whatever headsets that come from anywhere around the world, there's a lot of other alternatives in China that are being produced. So like no matter what the headset is, that you can just have an experience that's sort of consistent. And it's like, it's so early days that, and VR is still growing, that these companies are just trying to, survive and make this a viable, get to scale so that they can actually continue to do it and justify it from a business perspective.
Yeah,
so I think it's coming. It's early days.
There's an old Murphy's Law that says that's a wonderful thing about standards. There are so many to choose from.
Yeah.
So, the first time I read that, I kind of laughed, but it's so bloody true. But anyway, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thanks, Catapult.
Yeah.
Fax or sorry.
Fax, Maria. It's fax, like the fax machine. My question is more related to the medical side, but how can VR and AI affect us when it comes to understanding the body and the brains and whatnot? Like if you can implement some sort of system that can read your body and your brain waves. So
so there's a lot of and when it comes to artificial intelligence, actually some of the most compelling applications are in the medical field for a couple of reasons. One is that there's a very strict taxonomy for structuring information, and like you have very specific symptoms, and then you can take that symptomatic data and train sort of different machine learning algorithms. You can take all these people that you say these people have cancer and these people don't, and they'll be able to start to beat humans when it comes to being able to detect sort of things like cancer. So, but when it comes to be able to read your brain waves. This is, so I've gone to for the last 2 years, the Experiential Technology Conference, XTech. And so I've done a number of different interviews with people that are basically trying to integrate both the brain control interfaces, BCIs, and virtual reality. So right now you can't really do much until you have an integrated system. And there's some people that are, Mind Maze is an example, and there's some other ones that are looking at that. So when you have an integrated system, you're able to get all the different points. And the medical applications are the ones that are going to be there. And one of the things that they're really looking at is looking at neurodegenerative diseases and people who have amnesia and memory loss, and are there ways that they can start to take that information and do help them either give experiences or to help remediate some of these different things. Another company is called Neurable, and I did the demo at SIGGRAPH, where you put on the headset and they have all these different special contexts to get really good connection. So you have to use AI to clean up the noise when it comes to reading your brainwaves, because there's a lot of there's signal there, but you have to kind of get rid of a lot of the chaff. And so you can train to be able to detect specific signals in your brain. So I had the demo and experience where I was able to actually start to move objects by thinking about it. It was like mind control. It was like the embodied experience of being able to use use your brain to sort of move these objects. So there's companies like that are doing that, and again, there's a lot of medical applications there. So And Facebook is working on this as well, and they want to be able to have you just think and be able to type. Now, again, gets where when I did an interview with one of these the people that are coming from the medical field, having your brainwaves could be classified as either personally identifiable or health information. And what we have is this tricky situation in the future. Are we going to continue to treat that as health information and personally identifiable, potentially, if you use the right AI algorithms? So in other words, just like you have a fingerprint for your mind. So if you're giving away your BCI data, that could be potentially identifiable, and you could be able to have that information tied back to your personal identity. So the tricky thing about privacy is that the more that you decide to give up, the more then it becomes no longer a reasonable expectation for that to be private. Like as a culture and as a community, if we collectively agree that anybody can read your brainwaves, then when Comcast or whoever wants to say, okay, we want this brainwave data to be able to look at, there's all sorts of really messy privacy issues. And so that's why things like self-sovereign identity and data privacy is really crucial as we move forward into these things like BCI. It's really fun to move things around with your brain, but you may be sort of, laying the foundations for like a totalitarian state if you're not, thinking about these different, implications.
That's a heavy consequence.
Do you think that Zuckernerd stays up really late at night and just watches our brainwaves and like falls into a trance? It's like algorithm.
Yeah. I think there's a important caveat here though. I think that there's a lot of like using EEG systems to read brainwaves, quote unquote. Like there's more dichotomous things. Like if you have a more dichotomous like on or off variable to move an item and then pair that with your head movement, it feels like you're actually doing mind control over moving an item, but in reality the amount of noise in those kinds of systems and like what brainwaves that they can actually read with those kinds of EEG systems, especially if they're like dry electrodes, you're not putting gel in your hair and things like that, it's pretty limited at this point. But I think that the body-worn sensors and like neural lace and things like that, after we start to get inside the body, then we're going to get towards those kinds of things.
That's a whole other, like, neural lace and being able to do invasive stuff. That's basically, if you believe in material reductionism and that consciousness is emergent from neurology, then doing something that neural lace makes sense. If you believe that the brain is just like the whole body is an antenna to consciousness, to a layer of awareness and being that is beyond space-time, then something like a neural lace is just like, the equivalent of like breaking open a TV to find the computer programming that's in there, when in reality, the signal of consciousness may be sort of broadcast. So yeah,
but like
I think
optogenetics in mice, for example, they've been able to implant an electrode in a mouse brain, and basically using a light source, you can turn on or off the electrode and basically control whether the mouse is addicted to cocaine or not. So there is some evidence at least for the internal control and everything.
Yeah, and I think that like neural laces and being able to do like basically the equivalent of like hijacking the brain to be able to do direct neural injection of a virtual reality experience. I say by 2045, we're going to have the technologies that are possible to do that. And it's going to start with neurodegenerative diseases. So people who are dying of like some sort of Alzheimer's or something, like those people, their quality of life is so low that they're going to be sort of the frontier of really exploring what's possible with starting to integrate technology into the brain. And so it's going to start with so in a lot of ways, medicine is going to be the vanguard, the frontier of a lot of these technologies coming together, is because you have things like those neurodegenerative diseases that are going to be able to have the population who are willing to sort of do these experiments. But there's going to have all sorts of different implications of what's possible once we do that. And the more we do that, the more we'll understand about the nature of consciousness through the process of doing that. So.
Yeah.
We're at an hour, so I want to keep going down the questions, and it's up to you how late you want to stay up, because you can answer these in one word, or you can do a long response. So we can speed through this if we need to.
Just gonna say one thing. I can see a future where we have AI and VR actually be our doctors as well, so you don't have to go to the doctor to actually find out what's wrong with you.
Yeah,
I'm really looking forward to it. Like, I need to have an AI therapist or whatever.
That's what, National Institutes of Health just had a conference about that, and they were like, once we have body-worn sensors, you'll have all of that information steamed to.
DK, what's up?
Well, that conversation earlier on had me thinking about something I'd never considered before, and I want to comment on it. Maybe you guys have more comments on it. So in, let's say, 20, 30 years, when personal assistants and AI have combined and they're passing Turing tests, and you start seeing VR AI people going through these VR services, I imagine that some company like Facebook is going to have certain standards that they're not supposed to go and influence. Like, if they can fool at least, maybe not everybody, but the more vulnerable people, or maybe some of the older people, if they can fool them into think they're real people and get them to buy stuff, that would be probably frowned upon. But there's going to, I'm guessing that there's going to be companies that scrape mind data and all these little things that they know about you just from what you like. And then they have bots. They can just have these people that look like avatars that'll befriend you, become like close friends, and I may play these long cons where they just hang, like they can create lots of these clones, hang out with you, and some of these, and then just make you buy a new Jeep or something, or just maybe more digital stuff like this could get devious.
Yeah, that is a threat. I did an interview with a guy named Miles Brundage, and he looks at policy issues of like what are the immediate threats of artificial intelligence, and that type of use case and scenario we're a good 15, 20, 30 years away from, and so it's not the near term, but certainly in the long trajectory of like, and if you're interested in reading some of those more sort of immediate near term types of scenarios, I highly recommend you check out the paper they did on the malicious uses of artificial intelligence, and it'll be probably one of my next Voices of AI podcasts. I'll be sort of digging into that.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Because I think it'd be hard to legislate against completely. Like it's more like a company to keep their customers, they're going to promise not to do things like that. But I see it hard to make it illegal. Like, and there's a lot of gray area.
So one of the things that they were saying is that on the one hand, that's part of the reason why the OpenAI initiative was started. It was because they want to be able to have some level of transparency. And if you think about like open source, open source is allowing people to collaborate, and that's part of the catalyst for why AI has been increasing so much. But the thing that you really need is the data. So these huge companies can have some freedom of giving away the secret sauce of the algorithms, because it's not actually the algorithms it's the algorithms, but it's really the data that they have that's really doing most of that hard work. So on one hand, there's a transparency of like being able to know what the dual uses of technology are. So if you're an AI researcher and you're developing something that can do, something you think is great, but on the other hand is like basically like a toolkit for a terrorist to do all sorts of, malicious things with drones and wreak havoc on society, then there's these dual uses that, maybe there's a layer of, caution before you start to just publish some of this information. Maybe there's a little bit more of a, private, just like in security models within open source communities, if you find a vulnerability, you have mechanisms which you can privately discuss those threats. And so it's a little bit of like adopting an information security model of how both computer software is programmed and open source communities and software is maintained, and you start to apply that to the entire artificial intelligence community, where there are maybe more sensitive types of technologies that you have some sort of system like that. So there are policy people that are thinking about these types of things, and that specific case is something that if you look at where the incentives of capital are now, is that you can do these spams and just create a horrible user experience for everybody on the planet, but you can make a few dollars if you operate at scale. It's those types of things that we want to try to avoid, like replicating those types of spam bots, and just that are just going to make everybody's life just miserable. So being able to like report whether or not those are bots or not is something that is going to be a decision as to whether or not if you want just only humans or AI. Yeah, it's some of these things are going to be at the layer of like each software creator who is having experiences are going to have to make those decisions. Twitter's been very liberal about allowing bots, and there's been these network effects of bots, but Facebook has decided to only make things humans, but yet that hasn't stopped humans from sort of going on and doing other things that are sort of mimicking the trolling bot-ish behavior. So, but in Facebook, for example, versus Twitter, there's a lot less bots. And so I think there's going to be a sort of ecosystem of different communities that make those different decisions of how much sort of synthetic intelligence and how much like sort of organic intelligence and human intelligence there is. So yeah.
I think a good rule will be just for the industry to say, if you make a very clever AI, it's kind of like the at least the myth of a cop. If you ask them if they're a cop, they have to say yes. So if you ask, are you AI, they have to say yes. Although there's going to be real people trying to fool you anyway. So
that'd be great. Yeah, that's a great idea. I love it.
Robotics.
Robotics.
That would be one of them.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Oh my god, that's scary.
Thank you, PK. Rubik.
Yeah.
What's up? As always, I would like to bring negativity and skepticism to some of the topics. I'm going to start with cryptocurrency that has been mentioned a lot. Yesterday, Bill Gates had an AMA on Reddit, and I would like to read what he said on cryptocurrencies. He said, the main feature of cryptocurrency is the anonymity. I don't think this is a good thing. The government ability to find money laundering and tax evasion and terrorist funding is a good thing. Right now, cryptocurrencies are used for buying fentanyl and other drugs, so it is a rare technology that has caused death in a fairly direct way. I think the speculative wave around ICOs and cryptocurrencies is super risky for those who go long. So we mentioned a lot of the good uses for cryptocurrencies and what the good it could do in decentralizing. But we don't talk enough about the bad things and the bad thing it's actually causing right now.
Right. Well, there is a documentary in 2017 at Sundance called The New Radicals. And I don't know if The New Radicals was released or not, but it was a guy who did the 3D printed guns, and then he did something called Dark Wallet as well. But it was a documentary that was exploring this very specific issue, which is that they were like anarchists and libertarians who are basically like, we do not want any state power at all. We are proud of creating a dark wallet cryptocurrency that is allowing money laundering. And it is a challenge because once you go to that layer of like having complete anonymity when it comes to the transfer of money, then you are essentially on the side of terrorism. So then you have to like make the decision. Well, what do you do with that? How do you balance the community's interests of kind of government and state power, but yet allow the personal freedoms of people? And so this is sort of, I think, one of the tricky issues. And I don't know if there's a good answer. I honestly don't. Like, if you go to the logical extreme of cryptocurrency, you are supporting money laundering. You're supporting something that is like gonna allow people to do nefarious things. But at the same time, there's like a lot of state power that is in the interests of a very few people. If we have an economic and government system that is basically like, if it takes a handful of corporations to buy out politicians to create rules that are only empowering those people to continue to exert their power, then you have this same like tension between centralization and decentralization. So I don't know how it's going to play out, but what I would say is that it's not clear, and that there's these advantages to both. It is important to have, let's say, roads and things that are the government to be able to do things that if it was up to one individual, there'd be a tragedy of the commons, and you wouldn't be able to, have the sort of social safety nets that we have in society that is from governments. So I don't think that governments are going to go away. I think we're going to always have governments, but I also think that there are a lot of potentials that are going to put the power back into the people's hands. And those things are, even if it's not cryptocurrencies and specifically, it could be blockchain technologies that are disconnected from currency and are doing with like mediating trust and contracts and intellectual property. There's all sorts of tons and tons of different like applications of that as well. So yeah, it's a good point. And I think governments and cryptocurrencies can coexist, and where that line is going to be probably like a defining feature of the next 10 to 50 years of how those different tensions play out. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you for the response.
Thank you. Lyco. Am I saying it right? Are you here? Oh, you might be muted.
Yeah.
Right now, we can't hear you. I can't say anything.
Could be voice to text to speech as well.
Oh, are you maybe sending a message to someone?
I think he might be using text to speech because last time I checked, his mic was really loud.
We can't hear you at all.
Just give him a second.
Okay.
Whole music.
This is going to be an intense question. Get ready.
Yeah. Let's hope it's not.
Wait, Rubik, did you just get right back in line?
Anticlimactic.
Yeah.
Double
questions.
Angry-tastic in line?
I'm here to help you.
Oh,
Thank you.
Looks like you're trying to talk. Need some help?
make sure that the other two behind you aren't in line.
Click on him.
Check the Discord.
Oh, yeah, is there anybody in the Endgame channel?
Are you guys in line?
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay, what about you? You are?
In the Discord.
Yes,
okay.
Just sneaking in line.
Sorry,
All right, but
Lyko, we
then
couldn't hear
that's
you.
it. No more getting in line. We got to cut it off.
Mod powers.
I'm looking.
Oh, are you retreating?
Oh dear.
Okay.
Well, we let's go to
turn.
Oh.
I'm confused. Is this a bot?
Are you AI? Are you an AI?
Yes.
You have to tell us. Okay, we have an AI.
Oh, look at that shifty eye movement.
Well, okay,
All
so we
right.
still can't hear
Let's
you.
move
And if
on.
you're typing in your question, let's move on to Phil, and then but you can just
Try
back
to
up, and if
talk.
you can get it working,
Yeah.
we'll
Keep trying to
We'll hear
talk,
you.
and we'll tell you if we can hear you. We'll let you know if we can hear you.
Okay.
just start screaming or whatever and figuring it out.
Oh, so we were on the topic of company-controlled artificial intelligences.
Yeah.
So should there be a way how we could manage them? Because once we get to the human level AIs, some people might not like that.
Well, so there's something called explainable AI. So any AI that makes a decision, like, do we want to know like what went into making that decision? So there's that level, and then there's a whole layer of algorithmic reality that we live in today that I think that we actually don't have much of a dialogue between decisions or a ability to tell Facebook about how they're making those decisions. And it basically comes down to one person, Mark Zuckerberg, who is a majority stakeholder in Facebook, and he's essentially in control of billions of people's lives by whatever algorithmic decision he wants to make. So we're kind of already in that situation where the kind of the highly leveraged like places of control are already kind of like way disproportionate. There's no checks and balances to it, and that's a sort of a concerning issue. But in terms of explainable AI, that's sort of something that the EU actually had passed something that at some level it has to be able to explain why it did something, and so it's a challenge because sometimes if you think about like if you explain to me why you think this is a chair. And you're like, well, I just know it's a chair. It's like there's a certain level of unconscious processing of you deciding and determining things that is using machine learning type of technologies that are basically training it through a huge swath of data that kind of starts to become a black box. And so then the question is, well, how do you start to peek into that black box? And then how useful is it to be able to then start to try to symbolically represent something that is maybe in a language that you can't speak. The AI is already using a layer of symbolic reality of mathematics to do all sorts of things. And so the math is able to then empirically do a judgment. So for example, you have these networks of images that you feed into AI, and then you have these different algorithms to say, oh, that's a chair, that's a bird, that's a poodle. So you have like these tests that you can empirically get. So you have empirically driven results from AI based upon what you've been able to train it. But then, like it's for you to really understand it, there's something where they do basically aggressive like noise, where you basically have just at the threshold where you just kind of flip over the machine learning so that something that looks like it is utterly confusing, and it's sort of like finding those stress test cases. And this is an example of something like Peter Norvig has done an article called "The Technical Debt of Machine Learning," which is a really fascinating look at all the ways at which, like, if you're trying to maintain this system over time, here's some problems you're going to have. And so the maintainability of this is going to be an issue. The other thing is that the big trend in AI is doing something that is more machine learning based, but also like has more like old style constraints and planning, top down, sort of classical AI. So once you're able to have a level of perception, what kind of decisions are you going to be able to do to have maybe the logic that's on part of that? So that's sort of like the vanguard of like there was AlphaGo, and their latest sort of version has a little bit even more of that. And I think that balancing the sort of constraints and planning and the different classical techniques with the machine learning techniques is that fusion is where a lot of the most interesting stuff I think is going to be happening. So that's some of the topics that I'll be getting into as well with different AI researchers. Is they're usually kind of like on one side or the other, but the real sort of vanguard is like, how do you combine those two? And when you're able to actually combine them, then you can do a little bit more explainable AI. But right now, a lot of the just pure machine learning is basically like a giant black box that even if they were trying to explain it, it wouldn't mean much to you anyway. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's sort of what comes up when I hear that.
I was getting at the point of how can we prevent machine rebellion?
Like machine rebellion? You mean like
guns? Get your guns.
You're assuming that we should.
Skynet.
You guys are. I have no faith in humans. Like, let's go.
So
Machine robot
the
buddies.
question there is, will they have agency? Can
Well, it's also
artificial
accountability.
intelligence
Yeah,
have
Creating
agency?
accountable algorithms.
So I think that it's basically like is AI in service to humans, or are we putting AI as to be equivalent to humanity, and then we become a subservient to the machines? And I think I would argue that philosophically, this is my interview with Jaron Lanier. He made this point where he was basically like, look, these are tools for us to sort of exalt AI intelligence as to be greater than humans is kind of a fault. It's kind of a tool. And Michael Matthias said it's like a representational technology. So it's going to be working in collaboration with us. And so I think some of these are philosophical issues that are going to be faced. Like, you can talk about them now, but when I talk to the AI researchers, where they're at now is like basically their perspective is that a lot of those fears are misguided or being talked about by other people like Nick Bostrom, who doesn't have like a full education within artificial intelligence. But yet at the same time, I could see those arguments by Nick Bostrom as something that is actually really important to really consider, but we're a good 15, 20, 30 years away from that being any type of issue. So when you talk to AI researchers, they're like, you know, this whole like AI taking over is just ridiculous. Because if you look at all of the different issues that they have to solve, it's basically like, you know, they have to overcome so much in order to get to that point. So if you take a look at, but if you want to see where things are now, take a look at Miles Brundage and look at the report that they put together that sort of goes into all the different threats that are from AI. And like the Terminator AI threats taking over isn't on the list yet. So, but it will be in 50 years, I think. So we can continue to like, you know, is there a kill switch? Is there ways that we can sort of intervene? And those are some of the topics that AI researchers have been talked about. And then there's the paradox of like, if you put in a kill switch and you're building an AI, is the AI going to be able to like basically manipulate the humans to like get around them pushing the switch? And there's different ways of doing just reinforcement learning that doesn't have, it's like a neutral, so there's no positive or negative. And then there's the whole like the paradox of like, what if AI gets so smart that it's able to time travel and basically convince the people retrocausality wise to inform them to only do things that are going to create the strong AI. So that's another sort of like.
Does it help to pray to them, like assuming that this somehow gets recorded and they can look back on it? Like, is that going to save me or?
Yeah,
I mean, if you give them a
someone going that road.
perhaps.
You could be one of their pawns of there. But yeah, I mean, I think it's but. Not to sort of, I mean, I think it is a concern, but from the people that I talk to, it's sort of like, it's not a concern so much that it's something that they're actually worried about today. And you actually have the people who are like, if you talk about like the philosophy of AI as people are practicing it, it's not something that they are thinking about. They're thinking about it as a like a representational technology that has real limits, and they're trying to do actual useful things with it right now.
Some people are pretty concerned though. I mean, some people are warning, you know.
But who? Like the people that are doing that? Yeah, but they're not AI researchers. They're the AI. Like all the people that have been saying that are not AI researchers. They are like popular people who are doing things to actually, you know. And I love what. He's not he's a physicist. He's a physicist. He's not an AI researcher. He's a physicist.
Yeah,
like
I think some of this stems from like the stock market and like some AI uses that are out of control. Like some limited AI that has some. I think that's where some of the fears come from.
Yeah, and so I mean, I'll be this conversation is making me want to sort of dig in and sort of talk to what the the actual AI research communities, they're not afraid of the Terminator scenario right now. And I didn't of the 55 people I talked to at the International Joint Conference of AI, and another 35 or 40 after that. I haven't met somebody who is embedded within the AI community who is seriously concerned about these things.
They're more concerned about like predictive policing and things like that. That's going to be more harmful in the short term, I think. Right now.
And and again, I refer you to the malicious use of artificial intelligence paper that's on Archive that the lead author is Miles Brundage. Like, go read that paper, and that's sort of like the extent of the legitimate concerns of where AI is at.
Basically, AI is going to screw us over in a whole bunch of different ways way before we ever get to that point. So,
and he's working for the robots.
Yep.
Don't trust him.
He's a time tester. Answer this question for you. I want to keep moving. We're like at 90 minutes.
I'll be waiting for 30 years then.
See you in 30 years. Leko, did you get yours figured out? Oh, please say something.
Nope. I'm going to take that as a no.
All right. It's not working, Leko, so if you step aside, keep trying to talk, and we'll let you know if we hear you.
All right, Rubik. Nobody else get in line.
Owlboy also, I think, is behind Rubik.
All right. No, I think we're good.
So that earlier, that was a two-part question, and I guess the next topic was AI as well. We talk about all the good stuff that AI, I mean, we talked about the bad stuff that AI can do, but would you think, I don't know if it's a philosophical, like, even objective question, but do you think we're doing more good than bad with the current technology we are creating?
More good or bad? That's a good question. I think the risk is that the more that this technology develops, the more highly leveraged it is to do bad. And I would argue that the level of things that you can do bad with VR and AI actually requires like a whole moral and philosophical shift on what you value. Because if you take the logical extreme of our current value system, you have a complete dystopian society where there's 5 to 10 companies that control every dimension of reality. You look at like the long trajectory of automation, there's going to be a lot of jobs that are displaced, but there's also going to be new jobs. So the people who talk about it, they talk about like, well, there's going to be all these things of like, there's going to be things in careers that we haven't even thought of. People who are designing and cultivating and creating AI for interactive narrative experiences within like basically like a holodeck type of entertainment that's just, a giant immersive theater experience that you can go into, and it's a living story that you can go in there and learn all about like the nature of reality and where you're at and the dimensions of your psyche. That's the potential, but there's also like the more that we develop these, the more that the centralized powers have more and more in control, which again, it gets back to this, like, what is the balance of by which that we're able to temper that control of centralization of that power? Again, you get something like Facebook where we don't really know the full extent to which the United States sort of elections may have been hijacked by, and sort of hacked by a foreign entity, but you have a system that is basically set up for information warfare. So if you have these countries that are basically like fighting with each other, then the tools and the technologies that are there are just kind of a mirror to like the worst parts of like the human psyche, the collective human psyche. So like there is a trajectory of wanting to do the thing because it's going to allow us to have the human experiences that we want to have. But the downside of those technologies is all these like horrible things that we can do with it. And like, for example, like VR could be the most like enabling for like a private, like healthy expression of your identity, or it could be like the worst totalitarian like system that records all your eye tracking data, all of your biometric data, all of your thoughts, and basically is able to make a model of you and manipulate and control you into doing things that you don't want to actually do and that are against your interests. We already live in a society where entities and companies are able to do that, of kind of like manipulate you into doing things. And I think that's part of the backlash of something like Facebook, where, if they're optimizing for attention, and that's not time well spent. And so you basically are like, feel regret for 2/3 of the time you spend on Facebook, and 1/3 of the time you feel it's great. But yet you feel like your manipulation and your attention is being manipulated by these companies who are not being mindful of like your time, because they're trying to game your attention so that with the possibility that you're going to click on another ad. So the economic models that are driving these with sort of the incentive structures of advertising based like marketing is basically like a nightmare when you look at both artificial intelligence and virtual reality, which is why I think in some ways we need different models that are able to actually have a more equal exchange, because essentially you could think of these giant companies as stealing data and then creating algorithms and models to basically like displace all these people. But are they paying us for that data? How are they being able to like contribute back to society so that they're able to actually create opportunities and jobs? If all the money is going to Mark Zuckerberg, then how can we actually create a vibrant ecosystem where people can actually survive and participate without having to like struggle just to get by and just to survive? So like creating those vibrant, healthy ecosystems, I think, is the challenge of like this next era. But you know, whether or not it
was it you who was talking on Twitter about turning Twitter into a nonprofit?
No, I mean that's something that's happened within like
someone was talking about it. As
Twitter
like a
and
remodeling
news
of the structure
some
of how all that works.
Some of these companies, they're publicly traded companies, and they like that was more of an issue of whether or not enough stockholders would want to trade that. But Twitter's an interesting example just because it's like there's a layer of like journalism and news and information where once you start to become a public utility and it's something that's kind of indispensable for how society works, once you tuck that away, then it's like it's a huge gap. And so they provide a social function, but yet who clicks on ads on Twitter? I mean, it's like nobody really does, which is part of the reason why they're in such a bind, because their model for how they actually sustain their business is not like very sound. And so they kind of like, you know, they're fledgling to be able to do that. But I think that each and every company has that challenge of how to survive and how to balance the community interest. And so again, it's like thinking about what is going to allow these, you know, centralized companies to have a business model, but looking at these other alternative systems and structures that actually allow us to have equal exchange and actually is thinking about these deeper questions. And if I were to like name one theme of the future of technology, it's that. So
a tiny question, if it's possible, unless Lyco suddenly.
Lyco, how you doing?
Still alive. Okay. So maybe would it be necessary in the future if we had to require some sort of morality test for the people who actually create these systems? And because it's so fun, like anyone can start working on these.
Well,
the people.
There's a movement right now of teaching ethics and basic ethics courses. I mean, it's if you just Google or do Facebook, Twitter for ethics and computer science. So it's yeah. Wow, your hands are dirty.
Hey,
roasted.
What about ethics, man? Come on. Oh man, I've been shamed. I'm gonna go off.
Dirty man.
I guess they're distracting them for a second.
Never seen from again.
Yeah, I really caught it. So no, I think ethics and I think this is the question, like what is the basic like moral fabric or a collective agreements of what those ethics are. And I think that's like philosophy and ethics, I think in the future are going to be much more important, because it's like ethics sometimes are derived from what your basic assumption of what the nature of reality is. And if your nature of reality is that humans are just unconscious, like, well, or their consciousness is an illusion, that they're just objects and that AI is going to be just as valuable or intelligent as humans, then you've got real problems, because that's an ethical, like material reductionism can lead to an ethical system that is just a dystopian nightmare. But if you believe that like human experience is like foundational and primary to what it means to be human, then you're going to treat AI as like something that is in service of humans and in collaboration with humans, not that we're in service to like these superior entities that are much more intelligent to us. And so it's like the metaphysical assumptions of what the nature of reality is can drive vastly different types of like empirically different results in terms of what you value. And I think that that's part of the different discussions of why Like you can actually have an ethical system that's completely independent from any metaphysics or philosophy, but oftentimes those things can be combined. And so it's like, in covering mathematics, it was interesting because you can have people who believe that there are platonic objects and that there's an eternal realm of like reality that's beyond space-time, and that you cultivate a mathematical intuition to be able to ascertain the nature of the deeper structures of reality. Or you talk to people who are like more fictional, and those are the Platonists. Or you talk to fictionalists that say, well, actually math is just a human construction. It's socially constructed, and that it's just a tool that we use to do good things, but it doesn't have any deeper meaning. And you can be a naturalist and only believe that things are only in reality. And then you can have these completely differing like philosophical foundations, but as long as you agree on the fundamental axioms of what you're looking at, you can have different debates and conversations and productive conversations independent of whatever those deeper philosophical ideas are. But the philosophical predilections will make you look at places and looks at things that other people may think are completely impossible. And so I think that's sort of mathematics can provide a model for how society can deal with all these different sort of perspectives. And something like paraconsistent logic is something that is able to deal with like these different paradoxes. And so when I did an interview with Marilyn Schlitz, she said one of the biggest like skills for you as humanity in the future is being able to deal with paradox and inconsistencies. How are you able to deal with all these different like varying pieces of worldviews and information, and how can you get beyond these like ideological differences and actually like agree on a common set of axioms that you are going to say this is what we actually want, that we can all agree is our common ground of how we want a society to operate on. And I think the challenge is that we don't have those common assumptions of what those axioms are, and so we have this completely like fractured, you know, kind of nightmare of filter bubbles that are just getting worse and worse and worse. So I think actually mathematics and experiences and virtual reality and entertainment and sports, these are all kind of like things that people can have a shared experience and find common ground on and collaborate. And that, you know, as we move forward in society, these are the, I think the challenges of the future of trying to like figure out how to deal with paradox and figure out how to collaborate with each other despite our differences of worldviews. So, and I think that ethics is a huge part of just deciding what that common set of what we want to create as a society. So.
Thank you. Does that answer your question? Do you have a fourth question, Rubik?
Always. Always.
No,
we're
No. Michael,
do
come
me
on.
a favor. Lyco, do me a favor. Press V on your keyboard.
Just in case.
Does that do anything?
I change your mic.
I remember he had a crappy
No.
mic. I was going with Worlds of Him and his mic.
Can I take his spot?
So maybe it broke.
Yeah. I mean, there might be a technical issue that it's just not going to get solved.
We've gone on pretty long as it is.
Yeah, we've gone for 90 minutes. That was a huge. You covered so many topics. It's a lot to keep up with. I think that if people are interested, like obviously, I think we highly recommend Voices of VR for people who come here. It's like, is it up to like 600 episodes or something ridiculous? It's
yeah, like
quite a few.
627. Yeah.
So there's a lot of quantity, and the quality is fucking delicious. Like that's the stuff.
Thank you.
And then we've all been anticipating Voices of AI, and that just started. Like that's an awesome new podcast. And then you mentioned a couple others that I wasn't aware of. So like, what else are you up to?
So I have the Voices of Math that I've recorded about 47 episodes. And so that's looking at the philosophy of math, because the philosophy of math is different than the philosophy of science, which is different than the philosophy of mind. So the philosophy of math are some of these things about like what is the nature of reality, and it's a little bit more mystical or esoteric when it comes to the philosophy of science. The philosophy of science is very like, you come up with a basic like a prediction about what the nature of reality is, and you kind of like conditionally believe it until it's disproven, until you can falsify it. But once it's falsified, then you kind of let go of it. But math is more of like, once you agree on a set of axioms and you prove something is true, it's kind of true forever. Until there's an inconsistency in the mathematical system, or there's something wrong with one of the axioms. So it has a much more different way of how they structure knowledge. And so looking at models for knowledge representation and all these different like the more that you learn about math, the more you can understand about the underlying patterns of reality, the more you can understand about AI, and the more you can understand about virtual reality. So there was a layer of math that was sort of inaccessible to me, and I have an electrical engineering background, but I was going to these conferences and sort of felt like I was being held back because I didn't understand the deeper mathematical structures. And so I wanted to just sort of like stress test what it means for me to be a journalist and do what I could think was probably the hardest thing to possibly cover, which is a math conference. So I've done that. And it's had a huge impact, but that's coming. I want to go to a philosophy conference to do like more talks with actual professional astrologers about some of these various issues that I've been talking about. But most of the people I've talked to about philosophy have not been professional astrologers. And then the other sort of more hidden podcast that I've been doing since 2009 is about more esoteric topics ranging from magic, astrology, alchemy, UFOs, spiritual practices, stuff that is basically untestable and what would typically be considered pseudoscience. But I think that there's a lot of interesting sort of narrative, human experience, consciousness, things that I've been looking at there. So consciousness research and more frontier science. So science that hasn't been accepted by the mainstream yet.
What's that one called again?
It's called Esoteric Voices. And that's on like SoundCloud, and I'll be launching that at some point. But for me, I think that like I see, if I were to like order it in a pyramid, it's like mathematics is sort of at the base layer, and then the layer of archetypal reality and sort of a symbolic reality is more esoteric voices, and then sort of both of those of like the more philosophical realm of what the nature of reality is and sort of more metaphysical questions, and then the voices of VR starts to get into the more experiential dimensions of reality. And then the voices of AI will get into different models of intelligence and actually sort of putting things with bots. So the voices of math, the esoteric voices, voices of philosophy, voices of VR, and voices of AI. That's sort of my dream. If like once I'm at full capacity, I want to be sort of like seamlessly cover all those topics. And yeah, it's just a matter of doing it and also figuring out how to double and quadruple my productivity, meaning I have to find deep flow states. So,
would you say it's going to be possible for people to drop out of school and just listen to your podcast, and that will be enough to make them a complete human being?
No, I don't think that's ever possible to do. Just me. I wouldn't recommend that to anybody. But what I would say is that there's been a lot of people that have transitioned into the VR community solely by listening to the Voices of VR podcast. And I'm hoping that there may be a similar thing with AI, that people can start to do career shifts by being able to get up to speed enough to what essentially is understanding the underlying structures and the story of it. Because there's something about the way that I'm doing journalism that is going and talking to experts and me having questions. And then as you listen to them talk about it, you can get the underlying like understanding of what's happening. And once you figure out what that story is, then that opens up so many different doors to allow you to go through the hard parts of actually doing the work of doing the technology. So I do think it's possible for people to actually bootstrap themselves into the immersive industry, into virtual reality, just by listening to Voices of VR. I've heard lots of people that have been able to do that already. Yeah, the challenge is to continue to kind of replicate that and keep doing it. And eventually we're going to have something like Ready Player One oasis, where you can just go into virtual reality and you can actually have like an embodied experience, and that if anything, there's going to be like memory palaces that you can go into and then start to actually like see a physical architectural representation of knowledge, and you're going to be able to like go in there and learn about anything that you could possibly want to. So I do see that the future of education is going to be a lot more immersive and interactive. But for now, I think the podcast is it's a good start. Yeah. So
it's a great start, you guys.
That's wonderful. It's amazing. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much. That was incredible. Let's all get a big group picture. Oh,
group picture. I'll turn
no
off
one
the
disabled the. Okay, good. He's going to disable the security. So hold on a second.
To the teleport wall.
I would tell people about the Patreon for Kent.
Oh yeah, go to patreon.com/voicesofvr or patreon.com/voicesofai. Yeah, it's if you enjoy this, then go become a member.
All right.
And that's how I make my living. So
Even a
Thank
few
you, Andrew.
dollars makes a difference.
Ghoster, can you
That's
get one
right.
with and without the
Ghoster, maybe
name
we can all
tags?
go all the way back to the window. We've never done that. Can we like line up over here?
Oops.
So smaller avatars in the
Snake,
front.
yeah, Snake Boy, get up.
Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah, I'm gonna try to get sweets in the back here.
Ghoster, what should we be saying?
Ultimate potential.
Unlimited potential?
Ultimate potential.
That's my robot overlords.
Earl's away for this.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Ultimate potential.
Ultimate potential.
Ultimate potential.
Robot overlords.
Goodbye.
Ultimate potential.
Yay.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
That was
thanks
awesome.
everyone. That was amazing.
God, I'm exhausted.
Hold on, I'm just going to the cave.
Okay. Do you want to?
Quite a
Do you want to try and
turnout,
drop into the room really quick and do a debrief and then come back out here, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, that
Let's
might
have
be a
that.
good idea.
Hang on. See you guys later.
All right.
Bye.
See you, mean man.
Good night, everybody.
That was
was
awesome talk,
fun.
man.
Oh,
Maybe
thanks.
he had to go to the bathroom. That's a long time
That was fun.
to be in VR.
See you.
All right, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you, Ghoster.
Bye, Ghoster.
That's
Thank
kind of
you.
interesting.
Thanks for doing this. That was awesome.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Can't
Oh,
find
yeah,
my
thank you.
corner.
All right, I'll see you later.